Hello and a very warm welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. Well, India is not historically responsible for climate change, but India is taking steps to reduce emission as a responsible country, Environment Minister Prakash Javadekar said on the eve of the 5th year of the Paris Climate Agreement. Well, the Paris Climate Agreement was adopted on December 12, 2015 by 196 parties. It became effective from November 4, 2016. At present, India is contributing only 6.8% of the global emissions, and the per capita emission is only 1.9 tons per capita. In comparison, the emission of the United States is 13.5% of the global emissions and per capita is 15.52 tons. China contributes 30% to global emissions, while the European Union, including the UK, contributes 8.7%. Meanwhile, the latest Climate Change Performance Index 2021 has placed India among the top 10 countries to have adopted substantial measures to mitigate climate change. This is for the second consecutive year India has been placed in the top 10. However, there is a cause for concern for India. According to a study by the Council of Energy, Environment and Water, that is CEEW, about 3 in 4 of India's districts are hotspots of extreme climate events such as cyclones, floods, drought, heat and cold waves. The study calls for building climate resilience. In this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze climate change and India. Joining me on the program today are Avinash Mohanty, Program Lead, Council on Energy, Environment and Water; Manjeev Singh Puri, former Ambassador; and R.R. Rashmi, former Special Secretary, Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, I'd like to begin the program with you first. Let's first try and understand and analyze how serious is the world about tackling climate change.
Frank, thank you very much. And I'm glad that you've raised this question. I think if you had asked me this question about a month back, I would have had to say that the most important country in the world was not buying in. But I think things have changed. And I think we should understand that the world is more ready now than it was before. There is a good understanding in the world that climate change is real. It is taking place. I think it is equally important that we focus on another aspect, which is the forgotten aspect of climate change, that is adaptation. Let us remember that a certain amount of climate change has already happened, and so are its impacts. And a certain amount is bound to happen no matter what we do in terms of mitigation today. I am therefore very important from my perspective that when the UN Secretary General called for in his State of the Planet address delivered a few days back, and he spoke about a net GHG neutrality by 2050. He also added the need for very strong adaptation action and resilience action. I'm therefore very glad to see Dr. Mohanty here, and I believe that this is going to be something extremely important, particularly for India, a country which is vulnerable to the vagaries of climate change.
Absolutely. We'll talk about that as well. I'll take that up with, with Dr. Mohanty in just a bit. But before that, Mr. Rashmi, so what has India done really to deal with the issue of climate change? What have we done in the recent past?
Thank you, Frank. After the announcement of the signing the Paris Agreement, the NDCs that were announced by the Government of India, they have 8 specific targets. 3 of them are quantified goals, which all of us are aware. One relates to the emissions intensity of the GDP. The other one is of setting up electricity generation capacity from renewable energy. And third one is carbon stock in the forestries and non-forestry forest areas. In addition, the goals of building resilience, protecting the vulnerable communities, mobilizing finance and technology, and these are going to play a very important role. Now, on all these 3 quantified goals, the track record of India is extremely encouraging. In fact, the report which you just now, the index which you referred to, this is backed by a climate transparency report, where they have said that amongst the G20 countries, India is the only country which has consistently fared at the top. And the actions taken by India are consistent with the 2-degree goal of stabilization of climate. Of course, if you talk of 1.5-degree goal, there are many countries which have faltered. But the question is not of India alone. When you talk of a global framework of actions, then everybody has to put its contribute, and the might of all countries have to be taken together. But if you look at India alone, India has perhaps done by far the best, and it has done more than what it could have afforded, because after all, it's mobilizing its own resources and earmarking a large part of its developmental resources for meeting the climate goals in form of energy transition. But the point to be noted here for India and for the rest of the world is that it is not simply enough to take steps only in the field of energy. We have to work across all sectors of economy, which includes agriculture, water, fertilizers, community, protecting the communities from floods, cyclones, and vagaries of climate. And all of this will require a low carbon development, a climate resilient development. And we have to work in that area.
Right, absolutely. All right. So, Abhinash Mohanty, let me bring you into the picture now. And your study says that many Indian districts are hotspots really of climate change. Tell us more about your findings, and let's analyze that as well.
Thank you very much. Well, while every one of us is discussing the India's thought leadership around the climate actions and how it has steered this thought leadership globally, let me bring out why it is important to understand the adaptation and resilient part, what Mr. Singh has just highlighted. So basically, in our study highlights like last 50 years, which is basically impeding to a 0.6 degree rise. And within 0.6 degree rise between 1970 to 2005, we have witnessed almost 250 extreme events. And post 2005, we have witnessed like something more than 310 extreme events. Now, this has impacted 750 odd districts of, 75% of the districts of India is basically affected. And what is more important is many of those climate extreme swapping trend has been observed. I mean, more than 40% of the districts are showing a swapping pattern. Ideally or traditionally, they were flood-prone areas, and now they are becoming drought-prone. Drought-prone areas are becoming flood-prone, and some of them are even showing the cyclone and drought compounded together. So now it is very important to bring into this conversation that we just not should look at the climate extremes from a primary event perspective, because a cyclone may be a 2-hour affair, but the prerequisites of cyclone brings in heavy rainfall, and the post one, along with cyclone, brings in heavy rainfall, storm surge, and sometimes flooding. So all of this compounded impacts basically deparalyzes our infrastructures, critical infrastructures to be precise, then our vulnerable communities, keeping at stake the lives and livelihood. So this is something which is very important to bring into picture, and India's thought leadership can become a global case study to be represented at the global scale. Yeah.
Absolutely. Since we are talking about the global scale, we are talking about what's happening in the world as well. Ambassador, I'd like to take up the issue that you raised in your opening remarks, dwell upon it a little bit, and then take it forward. The change of guard in the US that you are referring to in your opening remark, do you believe that, the US now is going to see some actionable change as far as climate is concerned? Is climate action going to get a shot in the arm now going forward? And is the US going to start leading the way as well as far as climate action is concerned?
Frank, let me try and answer your question in 2 ways. First of all, I think the last 4 years was a bit of a pause in terms of international action on climate change, principally because the most important country in the world was not seen as a very strong proponent of climate action. Indeed, many would see it as a climate denier. We have now a sea change. Let me take you into the United States politics for just a little while. The Democrat Party, of which Mr. Joe Biden is a member, it has 2 wings. the moderates and the progressives, one of the few things on which both of them agree is climate action. However, let us also understand that while Mr. Biden polled 80 million votes, Mr. Trump polled about 76 million votes. And so we must understand that in the United States, the situation in terms of domestic action may not be easy and may not be conducible. Indeed, the Senate may not be with the Democrats. What does this mean? It means the United States will interact strongly internationally. I think a fact which is epitomized by the appointment of former Secretary of State, Mr. John Kerry, as their lead on climate and being made a member of the National Security Council. Now, the importance of the United States internationally is very, very critical. They contribute about 25% of the stock of GHGs in the emission. They are the second largest emitters in the world today after China. Their own per capita emissions are high. They are also technological leaders. And of course, they are the ones which have the largest amount of money available. When they become actively engaged, then they also need to do things themselves. And some of it they may be able to do domestically, but certainly internationally they can do a lot. I therefore think this is a good time, an opportune time for international coming together on climate change. You know, it is for nothing that I am wearing this green. All the rest of you are wearing blue. And I believe that one of the things that India has done well on is in terms of renewable energies in the country. We worked hard. We now have almost 4 times added the kind of renewable energy, solar energy generation capacities in India, and we've set really huge targets for ourselves. We are in a sense of being a kind of role model, but all of this requires 2 specific areas where the world can help and assist. One is technology, batteries, just to talk about it, hydrogen, the development of hydrogen, and the other is finances. All of this become possible if the United States is a strong player. And so therefore, I think this is an opportune time, a time to move forward for collective action on climate change and try and see what we can do on pushing things for the betterment of humankind as a whole.
You know, rather than coming back to you later on in the program, you know, since we are here and since we are talking about renewables, Ambassador, a quick reaction on that as well. You know, how far do you think the ISA and the One World, One Grid, One Sun, you know, projects such as these, how far will they go in trying achieving our climate goals?
Frank, I think the entire idea of setting up the International Alliance was a particularly good one. And what did we do? We also had a partner from the developed world, the French. Today, we have 88 countries which are members of it. Of course, these countries are what we call solar resource rich countries. But I believe that the most important element for the International Solar Alliance is really to do international action, which means, A, of course, galvanize national actions in countries, but basically to stitch together alliances which have a role to play in the global climate negotiations, to pressurize the world to recognize the importance of solar energy and to try and see what we can do in terms of regulations, in terms of incentivization, money, as well as technology. I think we've taken the lead. And in a very short while, look what India has done. Today, solar power generation in India is cheaper than generation from any other source during the course of the day. Things have to change to make it 24/7. But we have done a great deal. And I think we need a certain amount of credit. But we also need to ensure that the world incentivizes what we are doing. Because we as a country have a very long way to go. Because our development imperatives are such that it would not be easily possible for us to de-link or decouple GHG emissions from the need for energy utilization and the need for greater energy utilization for raising our GDP and a better life for our people, which is 17% of humankind, incidentally.
Right. All right. So since we are here then, Mr. Rashmi, let's talk about this particular aspect as well. You know, I'd like to discuss this for a while. You know, as far as climate action and development are concerned, can they go hand in hand?
Well, 10 years ago, this was considered impossible. But today, I think the situation has drastically changed. particularly in a country like ours, where today the cost of generating renewable energy from solar installations has fallen below that of coal-fired power. It appears that in the field of energy generation, we can make this transition at a much lower cost without compromising our developmental needs. But as I was saying, that we need to do much more in the field of energy. At the same time, we have to look at other sectors of economy where we are using carbon in a very large quantum and which affect the lives of people in terms of livelihoods and vulnerability to climate. So we will have to take a comprehensive and holistic view. So it is necessary for a country like India that while it looks at its development, it starts looking at a long-term strategy of development which is low carbon, which is green, and which is financed in a manner that we don't lock in our investments in carbon-intensive industries, carbon-intensive products and processes. So it is important that we realize early the importance of in making investments in those areas which are low carbon. And we need a low carbon growth strategy for this purpose across the sectors of energy, transport, agriculture, water, coastal areas, ecosystems, and then we have reached that. And since it is now possible in the field of energy, and energy contributes almost 73% of the total emissions of the country. So it's possible to take care of the balance 27%, but that balance 27% affects the largest number of people in the country in terms of livelihoods and vulnerability. So we will need to take a holistic view and evolve a long-term strategy for low carbon development.
So taking the discussion forward then, Avinash, let's also understand and talk about how do we mitigate the impact of climate change and how do we build, climate resilience?
Well, I'm glad that we are having this parallel conversation of mitigation and adaptation. Of late, we haven't been seeing through the same eyes, right? It has been a blinkered look. So what it is more important is just drawing the cue from what Mr. Singh said, we should basically draw in a collective action nationally. Now in India, let me give you an optics. In India, we have got National Action Plan on climate change, the state action plans on climate change, the state disaster risk reduction plans, even district disaster reduction plans. But all of them move in silos. Now, all of them do not have a particular inference to join in. So first point is to integrate all of these plans. And by integration, what happens is basically you are creating a scope within the public finance system of India to fund some of these climate actions, and that eases the burden, right? Every time we just don't need a global climate fund project to support our resilience or adaptation plans, right? It can be, very much from our own budgets, state budgets, national budgets, and from even the private partnership. Once you identify those gaps, once you integrate this stuff into a complete package, you find the financing module. At the same time, in order to do that, you need to have localized information. While these are all globalized phenomena that we are talking of, the global negotiations that are talking of, but the impacts are on localized format. So we need to integrate the localized, globalized concept nexus together to bring it up. Of late, we have been following a top to bottom approach. We need to go down and see a bottom to top approach, which is accumulated together to have this conversation going. Else, resilience building would be very difficult. So in a nutshell, 2 points that we require. We need to have the localized risk information having and coming in. So India need to build a climate risk atlas at a national scale, which is providing information even further below at a district level. And at the same time, India also should pitch in and find out ways of integrating all of this information into an integrated surveillance management system where they can integrate this and the common citizen, the public functionaries can actually have basic access to the data. Of late, there has been one more problem: democratization of the climate data. That's have been very difficult. So we need to simplify this data and democratize it and provide solutions at a more robust and simplified manner. Then only the communities can build resilience, and then only there can be a nudge to change the behavior. Else, We are not going to do anything sitting down at national capitals or state capitals in terms of building adaptation and resilient communities and societies.
Absolutely. All right, time to get quick closing comments now from all my panelists for the best way forward. So starting first with you, Ambassador, India, of course, continues to do its bit as far as climate change is concerned, or fighting it or tackling it. But who's going to ensure that, some of the other countries, say, for instance, China, some of the other countries do their bit?
Frank, we need green. And let me explain this. We need growth with renewable energy, enterprise, which means technology and innovation, and nature, which means environment. That is what we need, a coalition which pitches for green. Along with it, we need adaptation. And of course, overall, we need good economics for all of this. Let me say we need green economics. If we work in this direction with a green coalition, there will be a better understanding, and I am sure the larger parts of humanities will be with us, and we will be able to get the support of the most important, capable players in the world and bring them on board. You mentioned China. Look, they've already announced that by 2060, they would try and taper their emissions and in fact go GHG neutral. We don't know what will happen, but they have taken action in the last several years, which is why, in fact, they came on board the Paris Accord quite strongly. So theirs is a thing which they are tackling. We need to do what we need to do for ourselves, because India in particular is also extremely vulnerable to the vagaries of climate change. And we need to take this action. But at the same time, we need to ensure that we have space. And as Mr. Rashmi mentioned, we now possibly have the technologies to be able to do it green.
Right, Mr. Rashmi, best way forward.
Yeah, Frank, to me, it appears that if you take India as the case, as one of the important cases of vulnerable countries, we need to keep our momentum in the field of energy transition. This transition has become obvious to us. It has now become possible because of the kind of business models, and with the existing technologies, we have been able to bring down the cost of renewable energy generation. So it looks like we will be able to make this transition, but we have to speed up this process and the pace of transition in the field of energy to be able to replicate this success in other areas. And most the challenging, biggest challenge before us is that of the industrial decarbonization, which is extremely difficult, which doesn't take only energy, it requires other resources. So for industrial decarbonization, we need higher technologies like hydrogen, intermediate fuels, and power storage systems. We have to build a viable transmission and grid system. In addition, we have to protect our communities from the impacts of climate. And we need, therefore, the second pillar of our action will have to be in the field of building climate resilience. And the CDRI, which Government of India has launched, is a good step in that direction. But we need to take all the state governments together to be able to build a really climate resilient infrastructure in the country.
Absolutely. And Abhinash, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Right. Frank, I mean, this is really exciting and stimulating to understand about the Green Coalition, at the same time, the thought leadership around CDRI. But what India needs to do is India needs to actually spearhead this global adaptation, resilient and mitigation co-benefit coalition in the South Asian level first. Because whenever a cyclone hits, it doesn't only hit the Indian districts or Indian states. It has a very much particular effect on Bangladesh or other vulnerable countries. So in the South Asian region, this Green Coalition need to be extended. And at the same time, this needs to have a more robust, localized information system coming in together, which is at least bufferly funded. We need to find out the ways of funding some of our climate actions in the immediate step rather than looking at all these coalitions. We have enough of coalitions, enough of plans, but what we need is an integrated coalition which is basically funded and supported and acknowledged in terms of spearheading this whole agenda of adaptation, mitigation, co-benefits rather than looking at silos.
All right. On that note, then, I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. what's coming out of this discussion is that the world is far more ready now than it was a few years ago to take on climate change. Climate change has already happened, damage has been done, and more is going to happen in the years to come. This is something that we can't change. That is why it is important for us to adapt and be resilient, and that's the way to go forward. Also, like-minded countries need to come together, and we need to ensure that we bring about some kind of climate action and mitigate the damages that have already been done, and ensure that we pass on a better world to our next generation and for the generations to come. With that, it's a wrap. See you again next time.